At the National Eisteddfod in August 2026, First Minister Rhun ap Iorwerth visited the Palestine Solidarity campaign stand. An article in Wales Online reported the visit. "We call out the genocide for what it is," said First Minister Rhun ap Iorwerth. The First Minister is working with a definition of the word genocide that differs from the standard definition. Andrew Fox explains.
Remember, genocide means a deliberate attempt to exterminate a group simply for being members of that group. That's what genocide in Gaza alleges, that Israel is unsuccessfully attempting to exterminate every last Palestinian. Now, stand fast the fact that the only really high rate of Gazan deaths happened in the first months of the war and dropped to barely registering after the ceasefire. See graph below. One might suggest that had Israel been intent on wiping out everyone indiscriminately, they would have maintained their rate of killing.
The statistics show a disproportionately high number of casualties among fighting-age men, suggesting that Israel's motivation is not genocide.
But what about the overall population of Gaza? If Israel had wanted to wipe out every Palestinian, you'd expect that overall total to fall, right? At some point, the word genocide has to survive contact with arithmetic. Gaza's own records now sit in open contradiction with the claim that Israel attempted to destroy its population. Approximately 121,000 live births since October 7, 2023, against a reported direct war death toll of just over 73,000. The extermination narrative looks increasingly absurd. More babies have been born in Gaza during the war than Gazans have been recorded as killed, including both civilians and combatants.
The Wales Online article continued. Deputy First Minister Sioned Williams said, "It was frustrating in opposition and now in government to be told that we do not have a voice in foreign affairs, but we do have a voice to call out the genocide. There are people on the streets of Wales every week demonstrating their revulsion at the actions in Gaza, and we reflect those voices as the government of Wales." Anne Herzberg from NGO Monitor and Jonathan Sacerdoti explain how the demonstrations have been coordinated by very influential groups, with the first application to protest being made on the afternoon of October the 7th, 2023.
What had happened, for those who've forgotten, is the Palestinians burst over the border from Gaza into Israel, and it was a massive militarized terrorist campaign to kill, burn down homes, rape people and kidnap people, and worse still. And while that was going on, it took hours or days for that to fully map out. Some of those terrorists and infiltrators were in Israel for days fighting.
Yes.
While that was still happening, before any military response
Correct.
inside Gaza, barely any military response inside Israel, because it took a long time to mobilize, they had applied to the police, as is necessary, to hold a public protest on that day.
Correct. And I think it's also important for people to know, because they probably don't, 6,000 Palestinians invaded Israel that day. Several thousand Hamas, also other terrorist organizations, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and unfortunately, many civilians crossed the border at over 30 points. So this was a mass invasion. This was not, a few people with guns. They had a plan. I actually visited one of the kibbutzim that they invaded. This kibbutz happened to have about 400 residents, and they said 350 Hamas people entered their kibbutz. And they planned it. Hamas knew how many people were on each kibbutz. They planned, they went in. In the years leading up to October 7th, Israel had relaxed its requirements, and so thousands of Palestinians from Gaza would work on the Gaza periphery, on the Gaza envelope in Israel, leading up to October 7th. And many of them were mapping out the layouts. They knew where the heads of all the security committees lived.
They often knew where the weapons were.
Yes. They knew every home that had a dog.
Yep.
That's what she told me when I went to this kibbutz.
Yeah.
She said they first went to the homes with dogs.
I had the same experience
yeah.
when I visited the kibbutzim shortly after and met the people.
Yeah.
In fact, I met a woman whose husband was working daily with 40 Gazans in the agriculture of the kibbutz. They had permits and came in and earned something like 5 times more than they would have done in the Gaza Strip for their families. So these were the communities that were actually living coexistence.
Correct.
With perhaps the most controversial of the Palestinians for Israel to coexist with, and we're really pursuing that. And that is a detour in our conversation, but it's super important because that's the moment at which the Palestine Solidarity Campaign chose to apply for this license to have this protest. And then to go back onto the protests, I suppose what we're saying from that is they are an organized body that know how to organize frequent protests.
Yeah. And I had the unfortunate experience in February 24 to be in downtown London and walking through one of those protests. And I think there was no expression of empathy for what had happened in Israel. PSC was not going to organize a protest and also in support of Israeli victims on that day. I think that's what's really important. I did not see any signs for the hostages in any of these protests. I did not see any Israeli flags alongside Palestinian flags. There was no expression of, let's all coexist together. They were very one-sided. And I think that's why it's important that on that day was when they decided to mobilize this movement.
And actually, it's worth saying, because I think that is something that is easily missed if you don't think about it hard. There was no sense of horror in those protests, even from day one. So on day one, when they're applying for those protests and the earliest one started, I have to say, this isn't, I always say it's not a football match where you're team 1 or team 2.
Right.
It is a really horrible geopolitical conflict that's gone on for, about a century. And to protest for the welfare or benefit or lives or rights of Palestinian Arabs is one thing. But on a day when thousands of them have carried out that sort of horrific barbarity, it is weird, actually, not to have anything to say, in shock at that. The same way that I think people that are often making Israel's case are called on to be horrified by individual specific abuses carried out by Israeli soldiers, or, where those occur, it is almost always the case that people say, "Are you disgusted by it?" And most of those advocates, for want of a better word, say yes, it's horrific. And here were 3,000, you said?
Yeah.
And 6,000, excuse me. And not a
Yeah.
word in that protest, that early protest.
Yeah.
This is horrific.
The Wales Online article quoted Bethan Sayed from the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. The people of Wales have stood in solidarity with Palestine week after week for almost 3 years. Communities across the country have marched, campaigned and demanded that international law be upheld. These statements demonstrate that those voices have been heard. Colonel Richard Kemp explains the history of Palestine under the Ottoman Empire.
From the early 16th century, Palestine was ruled by the Ottoman Turkish Empire. It was the Ottoman Sultan, who was known as Suleiman the Magnificent, who rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem as we see them today. At its zenith, the Islamic Ottoman Empire dominated the whole of southeastern Europe, as well as much of North Africa and the Middle East. However, by the mid-19th century, the Ottoman Empire was well in decline and had become dependent on trade with European powers such as France, Germany and Great Britain, and also Russia for its economic survival. With this economic dependence came increasing influence by the European powers, especially when it came to the treatment of non-Turkish, non-Muslim minorities within the Ottoman Empire.
In the 1870s, at the beginning of the 1870s, it was decided that a proper map of Palestine of that time, or the Holy Land, needed to be made. So the end result of this project, which lasted from 1871 all the way through to 1878, was that you had this map of the entire country, 1 inch to the scale. You also had a set of memoirs listing all of the archaeological sites which were visited and with the discoveries which were made there. But also they provided a lot of information about the land as a whole, in terms of, for instance, those areas where you had forests, those areas which were utilized for agricultural purposes. Also in terms of the population of the time. They really provided us with a very detailed picture of the demography of the land, who lived there, and what were the differences in terms of those inhabitants within given villages and towns, Christians, Muslim and Jews. And I think this is very important in terms of our understanding of what the land looked like, its general appearance, and who were living in that land in the 1870s.
Before the Mandate, these were all countries living under the Ottoman rule, this Turkish rule. People are just holding land that is actually owned by Turkish landlords.
Lands here were centered in late 19th century in hands of big effendis. Almost all the villages there were neglected. They were almost uninhabited villages. And if they were inhabited, they were around the valley, not in the valley itself, and very small, very, very neglected villages.
If you look at the historical evidence, they are very poor countries. They're very unsuccessful. They're very underpopulated. This is particularly true of parts of southern Syria. Deeply underpopulated. They're not glamorous, wonderful, happy places at all.
If we talk about the whole population in Eretz Israel, 1800 about, estimation 200,000, 1830 250,000, 1905 500,000, WW1 600,000, perhaps 650. 1922, the first Mandat census, 673. These are the numbers, not more than that.
Looking at Jerusalem, at the beginning of the 19th century, there were, let's say, about 2,000 Jews in Jerusalem. We can see that by the 1840s, the Jews in Jerusalem was already a majority congregation in the city, because there was about 4,000 Jews and 3,000 Muslims and 2,500 Christians. All the population of Jerusalem were living within the city walls.
For over 20 centuries, the city of Jerusalem was almost completely composed of or limited to the old city. If you look at Jerusalem in the 1st century and the 5th century, all the way up to the 19th century, Jerusalem was the old city. There was very little outside the walls.
In 1863, British Consul James Finn, who was living here inside the Jaffa Gate, conducted a census of the inhabitants of Jerusalem. The figures were published the following year. Out of a total population of 15,000, 8,000 were Jewish. The other 7,000 were made up of Muslims and Christians. So by then, Jerusalem had a Jewish majority population. In the mid-19th century, Jewish philanthropist Sir Moses Montefiore was given permission to purchase land outside the city walls, which paved the way for the expansion of the city of Jerusalem. So to sum up, the city of Jerusalem up to the mid-19th century was contained entirely within the city walls. There was no West Jerusalem or East Jerusalem in those days. There had been a resident Jewish community continually here since the Middle Ages at least. And by the 1860s, the historic records show the overall majority of the population of Jerusalem was Jewish. When you look at the eyewitness accounts of people who travelled to the Holy Land in the 19th century, they speak of a land that was both desolate and sparsely populated. The surveys undertaken by the Palestine Exploration Fund in the 1870s confirm that. There is absolutely no historic record of an Arab people who called themselves the Palestinians, let alone a Palestinian Arab entity whose capital city was Jerusalem. Palestine then was not a nation or even a state. It was an area of the Ottoman Empire ruled from Constantinople, also known as the province of southern Syria. Yes, it is true that the majority of Western Palestine's sparse population was ethnically Arab, many of whose ancestors originally came here with the Islamic occupation that began in the 7th century AD. But the historic fact is that the territory known as Palestine has never, since the name Palestine was first applied by the Romans, been an Arab nation or designated to be an Arab nation. In other words, historically, an Arab nation known as Palestine never existed.
In 1947, the United Nations passed Resolution 181 that called for the partition of Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. In 1948 was the Arab-Israeli War, launched by neighbouring armies. The war led to the displacement of tens of thousands of Arabs. Haviv Rettig Gur is an Israeli podcaster and host of Ask Haviv Anything. Haviv explains the history of the displacement.
The debate and the question of the displacement of Palestinians has become fundamental to the debate on Israel in the West. And that fact alone, to me, is a sign of how just disgusting and stupid is the debate on Israel in the West, because it's the desire to relitigate the 1940s, but only to relitigate the 10 minutes of them where the Jew can be the bad guy. Like, if we're going to relitigate the 1940s, the Jews have some thoughts. All of that has to be wished away, and all we could talk about is the Nakba. It's so utterly, pathetically ahistorical that it's a mockery of Palestinians. Palestinian history, Palestinian experience is true. This version of this way of framing it is a lie. And these people care so little either for the truth or for the Palestinians' real story that they're willing to just have it be a lie. Benny Morris is absolutely, in my view, right. Morris's archival work basically shows us that the main force pushing out Palestinians in 1948, the mass displacement, was chaos. It wasn't, as Israelis like to tell themselves, the flight of silly people who were overexcited by Arab leaders telling them, run now, we'll defeat them, and then you can come back. That existed. That happened. But it's not the thing. And also, Morris, I think, shows very convincingly that there was no planned ethnic cleansing. What actually led Palestinians to flee? Fear of the Haganah and IDF operations coming in, stories that Arabs told to try and demonize the Israelis. Magnifying Deir Yassin, for example, meant that a lot of people were absolutely gripped by terror and fled, assuming a vast massacre was underway. A vast massacre was not underway. The total death toll of the Nakba, all told, there's a debate between scholars that runs roughly between 8,000 dead and 13,000 dead. That's one of the absolute tiniest conflicts of that decade and 3 decades in every direction on Earth. It wasn't a massacre.
After the 1948 war, Israel controlled most of the territory, excluding the West Bank of the Jordan and part of Jerusalem, which was controlled by Jordan, and the Gaza Strip, which was controlled by Egypt. After the war, about 800,000 Jews were expelled from Arab countries. In 1967, another war was launched by Arab countries. Following their defeat, Israel became an occupying power in Gaza, the West Bank and the Golan Heights, which was previously controlled by Syria. The Wales Online article continued. The hand-stitched tapestry was created by Palestinian women embroiderers in refugee camps across the West Bank, Lebanon and Jordan. It is difficult to know why there are refugee camps in the West Bank, Lebanon and Jordan. It is not usual for people to inherit refugee status. Haviv explains the occupation of the West Bank.
Why is there an occupation? It's really important to understand. And it's important also to understand how much the Israelis have wrestled with it. Back in 1949, after the Egyptians left the war, they signed a ceasefire agreement with the Israelis. And then probably the most successful general of that war on the Israeli side, Yigal Allon, came to the Israeli cabinet and he said, I have a plan. We can take the entirety of the West Bank from the Jordanians. The West Bank cuts Israel off at 9 miles wide in the middle. The West Bank is the highlands that overlook all their major population centers. And we can take it and we can be safe. And I can take it in 5 days, Yigal Allon told the cabinet. And the Minister of the Interior in the cabinet meeting raised his hand. He said, wait a second, but if we take the West Bank, what do we do with all the Palestinians living there? They're all going to, what? We're going to rule them? We're going to make them all Israelis? What are we going to do with it? And the decision was made in the cabinet, led by Ben Gurion, not to take the West Bank. 19 years later, the Six-Day War breaks out. Israel's under a naval blockade by the Egyptians. Egyptian state radios announcing the war is coming. The Israelis dig mass graves in Tel Aviv in preparation for what everybody understands is going to be a disastrous war. And Uzi Al-Qais, the commander of Central Command, the Israeli general in charge of a war against the Jordanians in the West Bank should it happen, actually says in a later interview a few years later about the war that there weren't really good plans for taking the West Bank. That wasn't part of the plan of the war. There were plans to take a third of the Golan Plateau from the Syrians because they were shelling Israeli towns and villages. There were plans to push back the Egyptians because the Egyptian army was the existential threat to Israel. But Jordan was not part of the plan. And then the war begins. And it was a very haphazard conquest. And they end up with the West Bank in Israeli hands. And then the question becomes, well, what do you do with the West Bank in Israeli hands? And part of these spaces are absolutely sacred, holy Jewish spaces. The Jewish quarter of the Old City was under Jordanian rule for 19 years. While the Jordanians ruled the Old City of Jerusalem, they just literally demolished everything Jewish. Medieval synagogues in the Jewish quarter of the Old City of Jerusalem were destroyed. Jordan, by the way, didn't found a Palestinian state. In the Palestine that it controlled, it annexed it. And it declared it Jordanian. That's why it's called the West Bank. It is, from the Jordanian perspective, the West Bank of the river. But Jordan did not believe in Palestinian nationalism and Palestinian statehood. It wasn't until the 80s that Jordan officially relinquished actual claim to it being part of Jordan. In other words, between the 60s and the 80s, Jordan didn't think Israel had conquered the West Bank from Palestinians. It thought it had conquered it from the legitimate ruler and owner of it, which is Jordan.
The Wales Online article continued. Each panel is worked in tatrees, the centuries-old Palestinian art of embroidery, turned here into an act of memory and resistance. In 2005, Israeli settlements in Gaza were removed and control of Gaza handed over to Gazans. The Gazan people voted in Hamas, and Hamas have vowed to annihilate Israel, as it states in the Hamas Charter.
The day that enemies usurp part of Muslim land, jihad becomes the individual duty of every Muslim. In face of the Jews' usurpation of Palestine, it is compulsory that the banner of jihad be raised. To do this requires the diffusion of Islamic consciousness among the masses, both on the regional Arab and Islamic levels. It is necessary to instill the spirit of jihad in the heart of the nation so that they would confront the enemies and join the ranks of the fighters.
Children and young people in Gaza are taught to value martyrdom. In the same year that Israel withdrew all its settlers from Gaza, Wafa al-Biss, a 21-year-old from Gaza, attempted to detonate a suicide belt at the Erez crossing between Gaza and Israel.
These were supposed to be the last seconds of Wafa's life. Instead, it was the beginning of a prison sentence. This is the moment she pressed the button to explode her suicide belt, and the detonator failed. But staying alive has only made her more determined to blow herself up.
I will carry my explosive belt once again.
June 2005, Wafa tried to cross into Israel from Gaza with a bomb, ready to sacrifice her own life to kill Israelis at a local hospital. She knew the hospital well, as doctors there once treated her.
I brought with me the video of when you were going to blow yourself up, when you were caught. How do you feel watching this now? Hard to watch?
I am very proud of this. I hope time will come and I will live again the moments in which I was tasting and smelling paradise.
Wafa was sentenced to 12 years in jail, but now is home in Gaza, part of a prisoner exchange. Over the past 2 months, Israel released 1,000 Palestinian militants in return for one captured Israeli soldier. She leaves her house every day heading for university to train, of all things, to become a journalist. But her hope is to leave a far different legacy.
Sheikh Ali Hammuda praises martyrdom.
There is a lot of talk about what we can do for Gaza. And indeed, most speakers will taper off their talk by giving you a list of things to do for the people of Gaza, and this is no doubt essential. There is, I think, another dimension of the discussion we need to share. And that is, what have the people of Gaza done for us? And how we should be grateful to them. And that is why the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he said, Inna ashkara an-nasi lillahi ta'ala ashkaruhum lin-nas. The most grateful of people to Allah are those who show most gratitude to the people. So let us trigger and activate this act of worship for a moment. We say to the children of Gaza before anyone else, thank you, Jazakumullahu khairan, and we salute you. We have seen how your 6-year-olds are standing over the dying bodies of their blood brothers as they say to them, brother, say la ilaha illallah, you're dying. Say la ilaha illallah. 6 years old, how did he pull that one off? We saw the young boy wrapped from head to toe because of burns, saying to his father, whose injuries are less than him, Father, be strong, don't despair, this is our land. Who taught him that?
HAMAS taught him that, as it states in the HAMAS Charter.
When the idea was ripe, the seed grew and the plant struck root in the soil of reality, away from passing emotions and hateful haste. The Islamic resistance movement emerged to carry out its role through striving for the sake of its creator, its arms intertwined with those of all the fighters for the liberation of Palestine. The spirits of its fighters meet with the spirits of all the fighters who have sacrificed their lives on the soil of Palestine ever since it was conquered by the companions of the Prophet, Allah bless him and grant him salvation, and until this day. This covenant of the Islamic resistance movement, HAMAS, clarifies its picture, reveals its identity, outlines its stand, explains its aims, speaks about its hopes, and calls for its support, adoption, and joining its ranks. Our struggle against the Jews is very great and very serious. It needs all sincere efforts. It is a step that inevitably should be followed by other steps. The movement is but one squadron that should be supported by more and more squadrons from this vast Arab and Islamic world until the enemy is vanquished and Allah's victory is realized.
Sheikh Ali Hammuda is recruiting for the squadrons by explaining to young Muslims that at their death, the maidens have been adorned and Muhammad is awaiting them.
Our predecessors, when speaking about death, it never sounded like a separation. It sounded more like a reunion. On the day of Siffin, when Ammar ibn Yasir, he stood on the battlefield knowing that martyrdom was near. He cried out, أُزْلِفَتِ الْجَنَّةِ وَزُوِّجَتِ الْحُورُ الْعِينِ الْيَوْمَ نَلْقَى الْحَبِيبَ مُحَمَّدًا صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ. Paradise has drawn near, he said, and the maidens have been adorned, and today we meet our beloved Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam.
They cannot break us, they cannot shake us, patiently waiting for guaranteed freedom. You can take our homes, but we will remain strong, 'cause Allah's on our side, and He's where we belong. Palestine, Palestine, wipe those tears from those saddened eyes. Palestine, Palestine, Jannah waits for your innocent life.